Trade and Industry Minister Ebrahim Patel says his department is finalising new legislation which aims to narrow the earnings gap between company executives and the lowest paid workers. The draft legislation will require disclosure of wage differentials in companies, stronger governance on excessive director pay, and enhanced transparency on ownership and financial records. Chief executives are top lawyers can make in excess of 20 million rand a year, while the official minimum wage is just over 20 rand an hour. The minister joins us now for more. Very good evening to you, Minister. Thank you so much for speaking to us. So, the draft legislation will require disclosure of wage differentials, as we said, and we know this has been a perennial problem. How are you going to incentivize companies to do this, especially if they fear being penalized for things such as fronting or just also, passing the buck instead of hiring people permanently, using, freelance work in order to, avoid paying people what they're worth?
Well, good evening, SABC, and let me perhaps just sketch context to that question, and that is why, in fact, are we seeking to address issues of executive pay. I think all South Africans agree that we need a stronger economy, more growth, more jobs, and in order to do that, we need to pull together more as a nation. But it's hard to do that when many workers feel that the economy, the outcomes of the economy is unfair to them. So we need a stronger economy, but that also requires a fairer economy. And one of the indices of fairness is whether there is an extraordinary gap between the lowest paid and the highest paid. And over the last number of years, there's been a number of studies that show that South Africa has extraordinarily high levels of income inequality. Our Gini coefficient is very high. In fact, it's said to be one of the very highest in the world of any industrializing nation. Now, of course, one has to be careful here because as we deal with any part of that inequality, there are unintended consequences. So our approach has been to engage with the business community, with the trade unions and others to see what can sensibly be done to address this. And there are two parts to it that we think would be important. The first one is disclosure, making sure that boards and society know what the gap is between the higher echelons of a company and the lower levels of a company. Let's be open about that. Let's be transparent. And based on that, there can be an intelligent conversation about what can be done about it.
As you say, Minister, you want to dig deeper in some of the fundamental issues behind this. So some have said the impact of structural transformation of wage shifts and wage inequality is really pointing to the existence of the missing middle in the real earnings distribution of those employed, that often that is ignored. But the fact that post-apartheid wage inequality is also explained by using a participation employment and quintile regression framework that shows that wage inequality has increased over time. So is that factored in?
I think it is factored in, and perhaps to pull out the elements of what has informed our thinking. The first is what you referred to as let's call it the legacy of the past, that in the apartheid era, wages were very segmented by race. And while race is no longer the formal category we inherited, enormous disparities between top and bottom. The second one is that over the last number of years, there is significant evidence that these inequalities that we have in society are not simply the function of the past, but they're also pernicious factors currently at play. One of the effects of global economic integration, which has brought enormous benefits to societies and to the innovation we see in technology, in so many parts of our lives. But with it has also come growing inequality. It's a problem that's global, that's not confined to South Africa. The conversation in the United States, in Europe, in parts of Asia is very much one of inequality in society. And so societies have to respond both to the past but also to the current forces that engender these rising levels of inequality. And so in doing so, we've had a number of concerns raised. One of the concerns is if we, in fact, take action on this area, we may lose our talent pool to other countries. And the truth is that our pay gaps are very high by the standards of peer countries and the standards of developed countries. So other countries are able to attract talent and enterprise without the enormous gaps that there are. And recall, Tsipi, so that the proposed legislation is not going to try to set what that ratio must be. It will require disclosure of that ratio so that boards and other stakeholders can work out a pragmatic path to reducing these the top and bottom end of these disparities. I should also bring a second part in, if I may, and that is the bill will also be looking at the power of shareholders. If you have a significant body of shareholders that are concerned about the pay policies of a company, the opportunity they currently have to express those concerns and to have those concerns factored in is very minimal. And so we're looking now at the modalities. We've given ourselves 60 days, it's 59 days today, to address these issues. And within that period, we would have finalized proposed modalities that go into the bill.
So we'll look at those modalities now in finer detail. But I just want to point out that some of the companies then point out that labor market factors are the reasons why there is this huge inequality, that sectors are not equal. Therefore, if you look at the growth dividends, you can't have a so-called blueprint where everybody earns according to scale. So how would you then deal with this new approach of worker ownership arrangements? You said that they should not be in the form of passive dividend flow arrangements, but be accompanied by mechanisms where labor is heard. So how will you enforce that, given these factors that I've also just mentioned?
Well, can I respond with 4 points? The first is we're not setting a uniform ratio. We're not saying as government, this is the ratio that should apply. But we're saying, let every sector, let every company disclose that sector. If they believe that there are good grounds for those disparities to be in place, let them set it out, motivate it, put forward your argument. The second point that I think is very important is there is no sector dimension to it. Yes, earnings will differ from sector to sector, but we're not prescribing a single uniform ratio that applies across the economy. We are seeking to ensure that across the economy, in every sector, companies do, in fact, disclose. And that is important. On the question of growth factors and so on, well, I'd like to point out that in economic theory, rewards have to follow performance. And so when a company does very well, ordinarily you would expect the executives to be rewarded well. There are two things that mitigate against that. The one is a practice in South Africa, but not uniquely in South Africa, where many failing firms, companies that are battling, also have enormous disparities in the wage rates between top and bottom. I cite the example that was the subject of significant discussion last year, and that was at the time when Sasol was really struggling. The board, in its annual report, disclosed that the severance packages of the two previous CEOs were quite high. And shareholders asked the question, legitimately, I think, why, when the company was losing money, when it was in trouble, were the performance bonuses, the exit arrangements, and the salaries so high? And finally, perhaps to come to the the issue that you've raised around worker ownership. So building a fairer economy and a stronger economy, because we also need growth. We need productivity growth. We need the trade union movement and management to sit down and work out how we can also secure higher outputs, grow the GDP, increase our exports. So that's the stronger economy part. But on the fairer economy part, it's not just the disclosure on executive pay that we're looking at. We're also seeking to put in place proposals that would encourage a greater level of worker ownership in companies. And there's been some landmark agreements on that. Coca-Cola, for example, has agreed that 15% of the shares in the company in South Africa would be held by workers, the 8,000 workers of the company. PepsiCo, when they bought Pioneer Food, has made available a sum of money that is expected to secure 13% of the shareholding of the company in the hands of workers. And so you have a more inclusive economy. And coupled with that, we will be looking at legislation to further promote and clarify the role of worker representatives on the boards of large companies.
Minister, just before we have run out of time, but I do need to talk about this. Some of the suggestions that you're looking at, working with tertiary educational institutions to assist on education of worker directors and potential directors. How would companies be incentivized to do that? But to also go beyond the general pay gap and look at, gender, and also just look at diversity gaps.
Diversity gaps are one of the significant ones in our society, and we have encouraged businesses through the BEE codes to ensure that their management are more gender balanced, that their boards have a larger number of women, and not as an act of social equity only, because it also makes, in so many cases, commercial sense that women bring enormous insights into the affairs of companies, and by enlarging the talent pool of South Africans that serve on boards and are in management, these are all important steps to build that inclusive economy.
Well, thank you so much for speaking to us, Minister, Trade and Industry Minister Ebrahim Patel. Thank you very much for your time.